Chapter 15. You know, a lot of people think that your family is just a bunch of lunatics, Maggie said as she stared back at the house from inside the car. Most folks believe that you've gone off your rockers talking about ghosts and goblins and such, especially the newer ones, the ones that moved here when SMR opened. Michael smiled slightly and nodded. He had heard it all the time when he was growing up. Only a very small portion of Lamplight Woods' population was aware of the role that the Dyer family had been playing for decades. Part of that was due to less and less belief in the paranormal as the years had gone by, but some of it was by design. Knowing what was really happening in the town would cause most people to panic, and it would also bring unwanted attention that could make it harder to do what they needed to do. Positioning his family as the local whack jobs meant that they were mostly ignored. The reasoning was sound, but that didn't mean that he hadn't gotten sick of the stares and eye rolls when he was a child. I hate to admit it, but I was one of those people, she continued. I thought that your dad had a screw loose. He used to come into my dad's bar and rant about some really crazy stuff after he had a few drinks in him. Your dad's bar? Michael asked curiously. Wait, Maggie Grant. Your father is Martin Grant, the owner of the split log? Sure is. 74 years young and still working the taps. God, I feel like having him pour me an incredibly stiff one right now. I know the feeling. She checked her watch. You know what? Screw it. We're going to need booze for the conversation we both know that we need to have. You up for that? He looked at her with a mixture of amusement and sympathy. Yeah, sure. Just let me call my daughter to let her know where I'll be. Sarah sounded out of breath when she picked up the phone. She assured him that everything was fine, and that she had just been out for a jog. While he had never been fond of running for exercise himself, she made sure to get a long run in at least twice a week. He told her that he would pick up dinner on the way home before he hung up. Everything okay? Maggie asked as they headed towards downtown. Yeah, he replied. Just my teenage daughter making me feel like an out-of-shape old man. She made a face. My wife is constantly doing that to me. Healthy people are the worst. Maggie parked her car behind the split log in a gravel lot. As Michael understood it, the bar had gotten its name back when Lamplight Woods had been home to a large logging operation called the Ambrose Logging Company. Martin Grant had worked a single day as a wood splitter before realizing that the job wasn't for him. He had decided to open a bar to sell alcohol to the other logging company workers. The name of the bar was said to be Martin's constant reminder to himself that he was in the hospitality business for a reason. Michael had only been inside a handful of times. His father had been a nightly presence in the bar, but he didn't drink much himself. It wasn't out of some revulsion to drinking or even a worry that he might become a barely functioning alcoholic like his father had been. He simply didn't like the taste of most alcoholic beverages. Maggie led him through the back door of the bar into the booth in the corner. There weren't many people in the split log yet, although he suspected that would change once people got back into town from work. She set down the files and notepads that she was carrying and slid into one side of the booth as he did the same on the opposite side. An older man wearing a white apron came up to the table and smiled down at Maggie. I thought that I raised you better than to drink on the job, the man teased. I'm always on the job, Pop, she answered with a warm smile. I have to fit in my vices somewhere. This is Michael Dyer. He's helping me on a case. He shook Michael's hand. Dyer, you say? Gerald Dyer's boy? Yes, sir, Michael replied. How have you been? He waved a hand in the air. Oh, you know, at my age it's a good day as long as you're still above the ground. That means that I've had a lot of good days so far, and that I'm having one right now. That's a great way to look at things. What can I get you, son? Michael hesitated. Just a glass of ice water, please. No way are you making me drink alone, Maggie chided him. He smiled slightly. Okay, fine. I'm guessing that you're not much of a drinker, Martin surmised. Problem with the bottle, or problem with the taste? Taste. Good. Your old man, well, best not to speak ill of the dead. If that's your issue, let me get you a glass of something that I keep behind the bar. It's from a small local brewery, and I guarantee it doesn't taste like the piss that comes out of the taps. Pops is a bit of a beer snob, Maggie informed him. You wouldn't think that a guy who makes his living from serving the beer on tap would be, but there you have it. Sure, Michael said with a nod. I'm up for trying it. Maggie ordered her drink, one that was much stronger than any beer. Once her father had left, she spread out the documents across the table. She took a ballpoint pen out of her breast pocket and grabbed one of the notepads. She looked at him expectantly. Okay, she said. Explain to me just what the hell is going on back at that house. I don't know, Michael admitted. She put the pen down. Well, that isn't helpful in the slightest. I thought that you're an expert at all of this. I'm an expert in criminal forensics. That's not what I meant. I know. He sat back in his seat. There's no such thing as an expert in the paranormal. The people that claim to be are either conmen or idiots, sometimes both. This is extremely disappointing to hear right now. It's just that there's too much of the unknown out there to ever learn about it all. Every time you think that you have a handle on how things are supposed to work, a dozen new oddities pop up that send you back to square one. They sat in silence for a moment. Michael knew that she was desperate for answers, and he wished that he had some to give. He scratched his chin as he considered the matter. Whatever is going on behind those walls is brand new to me, he said quietly, making sure that Martin couldn't overhear him. I have heard of walls bleeding, though. It's a phenomenon usually associated with hauntings. You think this is ghosts? Maggie asked slowly. He raised an eyebrow. You just saw what you saw, and you're drawing the line at ghosts? No, that's not what I meant. I'm just having trouble wrapping my mind around all of this. I know that it's real. I do. It's just... I get it, he assured her. Believe me, I get it. It's like you have to completely rewire the way that you think. She nodded. Okay, well, we don't have time for me to get all the way comfortable with this. If there's even the slightest chance any of these kids are alive, we have to move fast. Not to mention that we need to stop it before it happens again. The first step is to work out what we're dealing with. Right. She picked up the pen. So we're thinking ghosts? He looked up at the ceiling as he thought. I know I just got done saying that bleeding walls are associated with hauntings, but I don't think this falls into that category. Hauntings tend to be tied to places or objects, sometimes people. Multiple locations with different people is extremely rare, if not completely unheard of. There's also the matter of the organic tissue that we're seeing here. The pieces just don't fit. So what you're saying is that we're looking for something that has some of the same characteristics as a haunting, but also takes things way further. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. Chapter 16. Sarah didn't hesitate to tell her father what had happened to her when he returned to Forgotten Tales. She had made up a story about having been out jogging when he had called earlier so that he didn't feel the need to leave work, but she was smart enough to know that not filling him in the events of the afternoon wasn't a good idea. He needed to know about what was going on under the backyard shed, and if he already knew, he could hopefully put her fears to rest. He listened intently as she spoke, the bags of food he had brought home for dinner forgotten on the kitchen counter. His expression was impossible to read until she reached the part about the Siberian husky hand puppet in the final cell. The blood drained from his face as she described the encounter. Did he say anything to you? Her father asked intently. Tell me whatever he said, no matter how minor it might seem. He gave me a message for you, Sarah said, shivering at the memory. He said to tell you that he enjoyed his personal time with Evie, and that he was looking forward to personal time with me. Or you. I'm not 100% sure who he meant. He was silent for a long time, his arms crossed over his chest and his eyes glued to the floor. She had never seen him like this. Something was happening that she didn't understand. Did you know about that place? She asked finally. No, he answered, shaking his head slowly and not looking up. There wasn't anything out back when I lived here. Damn it, Dad, what the hell were you up to? Do you want to see it? Her father raised his head and looked at her. Neither one of us is going in there until I figure what's going on. This is important, Sarah. Promise me that you won't go back. She quickly nodded. Absolutely. I never want to go back down in that place again. I wish that I hadn't in the first place. I couldn't just leave Mira down there, though. Why did Mira go to that thing's room? Our family has a history with it, he replied. Look, I know that's not much of an answer, but I'm going to need you to trust me on this. I promise that I'll tell you everything later. I just I just need some time to figure out how to have that conversation with you. I don't understand, she admitted. I know. Can you just give me a couple of days to sort things out? I promise that you'll understand why when we sit down and talk. Okay? Yeah, okay. Sarah didn't sleep well that night. She was extremely tired, but the events of the afternoon kept replaying over and over in her head. Around 2 in the morning, she gave up and got out of bed, being careful not to wake Mira. She had been staying in her father's old room while he slept downstairs on the couch. There was a second bedroom in the house, but it had been her grandfather's. Her father's dislike of the man apparently extended to that room as well. She got up and went over to the window. She looked out over the backyard, but heavy clouds had moved in, and she couldn't see far enough to make out the shed. It was out there, though. She could almost feel it. She shook her head firmly. There was no point in obsessing over it. She picked up her robe from the back of a chair and put it on before sliding her feet into her slippers. Being as quiet as possible, she crossed over to the door and crept out of the room. The house was dark and silent. Well, mostly silent. Sarah could hear the sound of her father snoring even though he was 2 floors down from her. She smiled. It sounded like a freight train passing through the building. She couldn't be too hard on him, though. The volume of her own snoring had woken her up on more than one occasion. Across the hallway from her room was the closed door leading into the one her grandfather had used. Her father had only spoken of him a few times before they'd come to Lamplight Woods, and none of those times put the man in a particularly good light. She knew that he had been part of the reason why they had moved to California while she was still a baby, and from reading in between the lines, she worked out that he had been both physically and mentally abusive towards her father. Beyond that, she didn't know anything about him. She did now know that he had built a creepy-as-hell underground bunker beneath the backyard. She wasn't sure what that said about the man, but it probably wasn't good. There was so much going on that she didn't understand, and she had the gut feeling that at least some of it had to do with her grandfather. Her father hadn't known about the underground facility, and he was now involved in a police investigation. If she was going to get any answers, she was going to have to find them herself. Her grandfather's bedroom was as good a place to start as any. She walked over to the door and placed her hand on the doorknob before stopping herself. Most of what had happened earlier in the day to her was because she had indulged her curiosity without playing it safe. It felt like she was on the verge of repeating that mistake again. She glanced down towards the stairwell leading to the first floor. Her father had already gone through the entirety of the house, including her grandfather's bedroom, and he had pointed out a few things that she needed to be careful around. None of those things he had spoken of were located in the bedroom. She was confident that he would have told her that there was something dangerous less than 20 feet from the room she was staying in. That meant that it was safe. It was faulty logic, and she was well aware of that, but it was enough to convince herself to continue on. She opened the bedroom door and winced at the creaking noise it made as it swung. She listened for a few seconds to make sure that she hadn't woken up her father. His snoring continued unabated. She went into the bedroom before closing the door behind her. It was pitch black inside, and she felt around the wall next to the door until she found the light switch. She flipped it up and immediately closed her eyes as the overhead light temporarily blinded her. She allowed her eyes to adjust before looking around. Chapter 17. Michael almost fell off the couch as he was startled awake by the sound of his phone ringing. He barely got a hand down to stop himself from rolling off onto the floor. He groped around in the dark for a few seconds before his hand wrapped around the phone. For a brief moment, he debated whether to answer it or to throw it out the window. Hello? He managed to get out as he answered it, trying to wipe the sleep from his eyes with the back of his hand. Michael, it's Maggie, a woman's voice said. I know it's late, or early, or whatever, but there's been another one. Another. The fog lifted and he sat up on the couch. Another kid is gone? Yeah, same thing as the first three. The bedroom is covered in blood and. Look, the parents and sister are over in the next room, so I can't really talk, but I found that, growth as well. How long has it been? Less than an hour. I need you to get over here now. He tossed off his blanket and stood up. Text me the address. I'm on my way. Not wanting to wake Sarah up, he wrote a quick note and taped it to the railing of the stairs so that she was sure to see it in the morning. He quickly got dressed, splashed some water on his face, and grabbed a drink from the refrigerator. His phone vibrated as it received the address from Maggie. He almost didn't remember to lock the door behind him as he practically flew out the front door towards the car. He glanced at the time as he pulled up the text message. It was just before 3. He shook his head to clear out the remaining cobwebs and backed out of the driveway. He was so distracted by his need to hurry that he didn't notice the light coming from the second story of the house. As he drove, he reached back behind the passenger seat and felt around as he hoped that he had forgotten to remove the item he was seeking before they had left San Diego. He sighed in relief as his fingers touched the canvas. Pulling the black backpack off the floor, he set it onto the passenger seat. Since he was called out to crime scenes at all hours when he was working, he kept a few essential items in the car to make sure that they were always available. It was only through sheer dumb luck that he hadn't remembered to take it out when they had packed for their trip. The home he was looking for was located in one of the more remote corners of Lamplight Woods. When he had moved to California, there hadn't been anything in this section of town. He went down a series of newly paved roads that led deep into the woods before arriving at his destination. 24 manufactured homes were lined up neatly on each side of the street. They were all nearly identical, and each had a small yard in the front and back. Maggie's car was parked in front of the fourth one to the right, and he pulled his car up behind hers before parking. I kept everything the way that it was, Maggie called from the front porch. The room is just inside and to the left. I'll take a look at it later, Michael replied, grabbing the backpack and putting it onto the car's hood. He unzipped the bag and dug around through its contents. Maggie came over with a questioning look on her face, but she didn't say anything. Finding what he was looking for, he extracted a flashlight, a spray bottle, and an odd rectangular metal and plastic object. He handed her the flashlight. There were no bodies at the scenes, he explained, zipping up the backpack and slinging it over his shoulder. They had to have gone somewhere. There's a chance we can catch up to the child and whoever, or whatever's with them if we hurry. Benjamin, Maggie said. What? The child. His name is Benjamin. Oh, right. Benjamin. We might be able to stop him from disappearing like the others. Which one is his bedroom window? She turned on the flashlight and led him around the structure. She pointed at one of the windows and he hurried over to it. What is that? She asked as he held up the rectangular object. It's an ultraviolet light, he replied, turning it on and bathing the side of the house in a faint bluish-purple glow. It's used to detect certain fluids. I've never seen one that looks like that before. I was under the impression that UV lights don't pick up blood. He shook his head slightly as he closely examined the siding under the window. It doesn't. Blood doesn't fluoresce. It does show other types of body fluids, though. Saliva, urine, semen, that sort of thing. I've got something else for the blood. He turned off the light and set it down on the ground off to one side. Using the small bottle, he began to lightly spray the grass underneath the window. Almost immediately, it began to glow a soft blue. Luminol, he said. Normally it takes a bit longer for the blood to start luminescing, but there's a lot of it. I'm not surprised based on how you described the state of the bedroom. They followed the direction the blood trail led, and Michael sprang the ground ahead of them as they walked to make sure they were going the right way. He used as little of the chemical as possible. He wasn't sure how far the trail would lead them, and this was his only bottle of luminol. If he ran out, they would have to hope that the flashlight and ultraviolet light would be enough to continue on. The trail led away from the manufactured homes and into the woods. Their progress was slowed as they traversed the difficult terrain. Masses of branches, leaves, and fallen trees forced them to either go over or around them. Michael stumbled a few times and paid for each one with a number of painful scratches. The amount of blood on the ground began to increase. He held up a hand as he came to a stop. Pointing down at the faintly glowing splatter on the ground, he leaned in so that his lips were almost touching Maggie's ear. "We're close," he whispered as quietly as he could. "Whoever we're following is slowing down, and the blood here is fresher." She nodded her understanding and slowly took her gun out of the holster. They continued on at a pace barely above a crawl, trying to make as little noise as possible as the twigs and leaves cracked under their feet. There was no way that they were going to be able to hide their approach. With any luck, their quarry wouldn't hear them until they were as close as possible. Michael came to a stop as he heard a sound from in front of them. It was a voice, a deep male one, but it was oddly distorted. There was a slight echo, like the voice was being projected out of multiple speakers. Maggie must have heard it as well. She tapped him on the shoulder and slowly moved past him, the gun gripped in both hands. The barrel was pointed downward, but the expression on her face as she went by him made it clear that she was ready to use it if necessary. The voice continued to speak, but he couldn't make out any of the words. As he followed Maggie, he realized that it wasn't that he was having trouble understanding the words, that the speaker was simply rambling nonsense. He turned his head slightly and listened. It didn't seem like random sounds. It was more like a language that he didn't recognize. Maggie came to a halt. She lowered her gun as her shoulders slumped in relief. He heard her sigh. "Benjamin Henderson," she said. "Your family is worried sick about you." Chapter 18. Michael walked forward to stand next to Maggie. A young boy of maybe 6 or 7 was sitting on his knees near a tree directly ahead of them, his arms crossed over his chest and his body covered in blood. He was wearing a pair of pajama pants and what had once been a white short-sleeved shirt. His eyes stared at the sheriff blankly as he continued to speak in the strange voice they had heard as they approached. Maggie started to holster her gun, but Michael touched her hand and shook his head. She gave him a puzzled look, but she kept the weapon drawn. He knelt down in front of the boy and quickly looked him over. There weren't any cuts or lacerations that he could see. The blood he was covered in wasn't his. Benjamin didn't even seem to notice the brief examination. Michael set down the backpack and put away the spray bottle and ultraviolet light. He extracted a pen light from one of the side pockets and clicked it on. Benjamin didn't react when he shined the light in the boy's eyes. There wasn't even any dilation of the pupil. He checked the boy's pulse. It was beating strong and fast. Too strong and fast, in fact. It was a wonder that the kid's heart hadn't exploded. He'd never felt a pulse that hard and steady before. "What's wrong with him?" Maggie asked, her voice strained. "It's a possession," Michael answered, slipping the penlight into his pocket and standing up. Possessed as in, like, poltergeist?" Poltergeist wasn't about possession. It was about vengeful spirits that attacked a family because their house was built on... He stopped himself. "Yeah, that's not really important right now, is it? Sorry. You're on the right track." "So this boy is being possessed by a ghost." He hesitated. "I don't think it's a ghost. His body's been taken over by something, but I've never read or heard about a spirit acting like this." "How many of these have you investigated personally?" "This is the first time I've seen a possession in person." "Great." She shook her head. "I guess we'll just have to stumble through this together." He shot her a quick smile. "Guess so. The first step is to figure out what we're dealing with. We won't know if it's safe to move him or not until we do. I'm going to try to..." Michael trailed off. He thought that he had heard Benjamin mumble something that he understood, or at least partially did. He leaned in closer and listened carefully to the strange, harsh words being spoken. Less than a minute later, he heard it again. "Stella Reprobi," he repeated quietly. "What did you say?" Maggie asked. He raised his voice. "Stella Reprobi. It means fallen star in Latin." Benjamin turned his head slightly to bring his blank gaze towards Michael. The boy continued to speak, the volume of his voice increasing as he did so. Things began to click into place in Michael's mind, and his eyes went wide as he realized what he was seeing. He quickly grabbed the backpack and retrieved the ultraviolet light. "You had the wrong movie," he said, slowly backing away from the child. "Less poltergeist. More exorcist." "Now's not the time to be vague," Maggie told him as Benjamin slowly got to his feet, his arms limp at his side. The wind started to pick up. There had only been the faintest of breezes a moment before, and the air had been thick with humidity. The gusts of air were now faster and more frequent. They carried a chill with the raw scent of winter. "Stella Reprobi," Michael said. "Fallen star. It's a biblical reference." "Lucifer was expelled from heaven," she said as she picked up on what he was getting at. "I remember it from Sunday school. He was cast down along with the other angels that rebelled. He was referred to as the fallen star. Then this is..." "Yeah." He turned on the ultraviolet light and pointed it at the boy. "It's a demon." Michael had a hard time wrapping his head around what he was seeing. The glow of the ultraviolet light completely changed the way that Benjamin looked. It reminded him of a double-exposed picture of a person. He could see the boy, but there was something else laid directly over top of his features. There were large jaws with ragged teeth snapping open and shut, and eyes that swiveled rapidly around their sockets. It pushed against some invisible barrier like it was trying to claw itself out of Benjamin's body. "Jesus Christ," Maggie exclaimed in a strangled voice. He ignored her. He rapidly ran through their list of options. There were only 3 things that he knew of that could hurt a demon. The first was iron, but he couldn't see how they could use that without harming Benjamin in the process. The second thing was silver. That had the same issues as iron. That just left salt, he nearly yelled. "We need salt." "No," she corrected him sharply. "We need to run." Benjamin had started to amble towards them. He lashed out with one arm and bashed in the top of a fallen log effortlessly. The boy opened his mouth and let out an inhuman shriek. "Go!" she shouted. They turned and bolted. Moving as quickly as he could over the uneven forest floor, Michael plunged forward into the darkness. The flashlight that Maggie was carrying was swinging wildly, its beam flying off in all directions as she moved. He could hear Benjamin crashing through the woods after them. His shoulder struck an unseen branch, and he swore as he dropped the ultraviolet light. There was no time to stop to retrieve it, though, and he continued on as he gritted his teeth in pain. Even if the demon didn't catch up to them, they were liable to break their necks during their escape attempt. Maggie was in better shape than he was, and she began to pull ahead by a large margin as they continued on. His lungs screamed at him to stop as his limbs grew heavier, but he forced himself to continue. The sounds of pursuit from behind him were growing louder, though, and he knew that he wouldn't make it out of the woods before the demon caught up with him. It was unnaturally fast for being in such a small body. His only choice was to hide and hope that Maggie made it out alive. He pulled the penlight out of his pocket and quickly turned on the light just long enough to see the area directly in front of him. Locating 2 fallen trees to his right, he turned off the light and hurried behind them. There was a gap between one of them and the ground, and he forced his body into the small space. He was breathing heavily. In an attempt to hide the noise, he covered his mouth and nose with his forearm. The crashing sounds of his pursuer approached. The noise grew quieter as the demon slowed down. He felt his heart sink. It must have known that he had stopped. The branches and leaves under the boy's feet crunched as the demon moved in front of the fallen tree. Michael was uncomfortably reminded of the sound of breaking bones. The boy grunted as the entity moved its legs. It came closer and began to walk around the trees and towards his hiding spot. He closed his eyes and tried his best to remain silent and still. An owl hooted from somewhere in the distance. The demon stopped its advance, and for what seemed like an eternity, the only thing Michael heard was his heart beating in his ears. A minute passed, and then 2. The owl hooted a second time. The crashing began again, but this time it was headed away from him and towards the direction of the animal. He listened as the sound faded away completely. For a long while, Michael laid in the mud, his entire body shaking. Chapter 19. Michael emerged from the woods feeling completely exhausted. After managing to get himself back out from under the fallen trees, he had slowly made his way through the forest in the direction that he thought led back towards the houses. Luckily, he had been right. He breathed a heavy sigh of relief as he left the last of the trees behind him. He held up a hand and squinted as a light was beamed towards his face. A tired and disheveled Maggie approached him as she put her gun back into its holster. The expression on her face was one of pure relief. "Oh, thank God," she said. "I thought you were done for when we got split up." "Not quite," he replied, happy to see that she had escaped as well. "It wasn't for lack of trying, though. Mind putting down the flashlight?" "Fuck, sorry." She turned it off. "How did you get away?" "I almost didn't. The demon got distracted and went off to hunt something else. It's like it operates entirely on instinct." "Good." He blinked. "You lost me on that one. Going off of instinct means that it's more like an animal than a person. It'll be easier to set a trap." Michael shook his head. "I'm all for stopping this thing, but do you think it's a good idea to go after it in the dark? It seems like it would be smarter to wait until morning and regroup. Go back in there prepared now that we know what we're looking for." Maggie pushed an errant lock of hair out of her face. "I'd love nothing more than to do that, but we can't. That's a kid out there. No matter what's inside of him, he's still a kid. Can you guarantee me that Benjamin Henderson won't get hurt or worse if we leave him out there until daylight?" "No," he admitted. "Then it has to be tonight. What distracted it when it stopped coming after you?" "An owl making a noise, at least 50 yards away from where I was." She considered things for a moment. "We might be able to use sound to draw it out of the woods and give us more room to work with. What do you need to get the demon out of the kid?" Michael shook his head. "Maggie, I don't know for sure that I can get it out." "Okay, I get that, but give me your best guess here. What do you need?" He rubbed his sore shoulder. "I'll need salt, as much of it as you can get your hands on quickly. I'll also need to be restrained for as long as possible. We'll need someone to tie him down." "I'll see what I can do. Back in a few minutes." He watched her hurry back to the Hendersons' house and around the side to the front door. Turning back to the matter at hand, he searched around on the ground until he found a long, heavy stick. He used it to carve a large circle in the turf. Once he had finished, he started to draw a series of complex patterns in the dirt inside of the circle. He wasn't adept at magic by any stretch of the imagination, and he wasn't sure that he fully remembered the exact design, but he thought that the end result was pretty close to the protection seal his grandfather had taught him back when he was a child. Even if he did have it right, he didn't know if it worked against demons or not. Couldn't hurt, though, so it was worth the attempt. He finished and tossed the branch off to one side. All of this was assuming that they could lure the thing possessing Benjamin. Maggie seemed confident that they could do it. For his part, he remained skeptical. They didn't even know if it was still in the general area. At the speed it had been chasing them, it could be far away by now. It was entirely possible that the boy was gone for good. Michael wiped at the sweat dripping from his brow and looked up at the edge of the forest. The moon picked that moment to break through the clouds, and in the faint light that it provided, he could clearly see Benjamin standing just outside of the tree line, his eyes still blank, but the rest of his face contorted in hatred. So much for the gone for good theory. He slowly backed away until the entire seal he had drawn was between him and the boy. Benjamin simply stood near the trees and watched him. He risked a glance over his shoulder. Maggie hadn't come out of the house yet. With a loud grunt, the boy began to advance. "Ah, shit," Michael muttered under his breath. Benjamin reached the ends of the seal and stopped. He looked down at the markings with a tilt of his head. Michael had hoped that he would just walk blindly into it, but the demon must have been smarter than they had given it credit for. Either that, or it instinctively knew that the pattern was dangerous. The boy started to circle around it, and Michael moved in the same direction to keep it between them. They were locked in a strange sort of dance together. They rotated all the way around the circle so that Michael ended up where Benjamin had started, and vice versa. Benjamin stopped and snarled in frustration. Although he couldn't see the demon itself without the ultraviolet light, Michael knew that it must be incensed that it couldn't reach him. He felt his cheek twitch. It was a good thing that he had paid attention when his grandfather taught the circle to him. He watched as the boy got down on his hands and knees and started tearing grass out of the ground angrily. Michael watched in fascination. He had heard that gorillas did the same thing as a warning. It had something to do with claiming territory. Benjamin raised his eyes and looked directly at Michael. The boy stood back up and clenched his hands into fists, bits of grass still hanging from them. Pulling his lips back in a snarl, he stepped over the edge of the circle. The lines that had been drawn in the dirt began to hum. That was the best way that Michael could describe the sound. It was like electricity running through a generator. The seal was definitely reacting to the presence of the demon. Nothing else happened. The low humming continued, but Benjamin continued to walk right through the seal. Michael took a couple of steps back. The seal was reacting to the demon, but the human body encasing it was shielding it from the effects. Ah, shit, he repeated. Chapter 20. Maggie practically broke down the Hendersons' front door as she rushed into the house. The manufactured home wasn't large. It only took a few long strides to reach the kitchen. She quickly began opening cabinets. Sheriff Grant? Paige Henderson called from the doorway. What are you doing? Did you find Benny? I need salt, Maggie replied as she continued her frenzied rummaging. Honey? Dennis Henderson asked as he appeared at his wife's side. What's going on? It's the sheriff, Mrs. Henderson answered. She says that she needs salt. Salt? Why does she need salt? I don't know. I could ask her. Sheriff, why do you need salt? I don't have time to explain, Maggie said as she started to get aggravated. Where do you keep it? There's a salt shaker on the dining room table, Mr. Henderson offered. I need more than that. What did you use to fill the shaker? A bag of salt. Maggie ground her teeth. And where's that bag of salt now? Oh, I threw it out, Mrs. Henderson informed her. There wasn't anything left after I filled the shaker. Dennis picked up a new bag while he was at the store. She felt her face growing warm. And where did he put the new bag? On the counter. Mrs. Henderson shook her head. He's always leaving things on the counter and forgetting them. I had to put it away. That's right, she did, Mr. Henderson agreed. For the fucking love of all that's holy, where the fuck is the fucking salt now? Maggie roared. Their eyes wide and mouths hanging open, both the Hendersons pointed at a cabinet above the sink. Maggie threw open the door and found 2 sealed bags of salt inside. She grabbed them both and spun on her heel to face the homeowners once again. Do you have any rope? She asked. Before they could reply, however, she gave them a scathing look. If you do, just tell me where the hell to find it at this very second. No rope, Mr. Henderson answered, still in shock. No rope. How about... She thought for a few seconds. What about an extension cord? A long one, at least 6 feet. We have one in the hallway closet, Mrs. Henderson said. Thank you. Turn off all the lights in the house, then get your daughter and lock yourselves in one of the bedrooms. I'm sorry, there's no time to explain. Just do it. Maggie hurried to the closet and dug around inside until she found the extension cord. It was round and orange, and had been neatly wound up and secured with twist ties. She looped it over one shoulder and went back outside. She heard a loud growl as she came around the side of the house. Near the tree line, Michael was holding out his hands in front of him as Benjamin Henderson approached him. She started running in his direction, the bags of salt gripped tightly in her arms. Michael must have seen her coming. He started waving his arms and yelling at Benjamin, making sure that the boy's attention remained fixed on him and away from the house. She crossed the rest of the distance and, not sure what else to do, swung one of the bags of salt as hard as she could at the possessed child. The heavy bag caught him in the side and lifted him completely off of his feet. He hit the ground hard, but he recovered quickly and started getting back up. She dropped the bags and grabbed him around the waist in an attempt to wrestle him back down. The kid's strength was incredible, and he quickly started to break free of her grip. Benjamin shrieked as Michael threw a handful of salt into his face. It was a pain scream, and she winced as it made her ears start to ring. The distraction allowed her to force him to the ground. I can't hold him for long, she said, struggling to maintain control. You need to get him tied up. Michael undid the twist ties around the extension cord and unwrapped it from her arm. He looped it around Benjamin's feet and knotted it. She shifted her hold on the boy slightly so that he could get the hands as well. When he was finished, she cautiously released her grip and got up. Benjamin was thrashing around and yelling up at them in that same horrible language she'd been spouting in the woods, but his bonds held. Damn it, she said with a shake of her head. The salt affected it, Michael told her. We have a real chance at getting this thing out of him. It's not that. I'm mad because I just had to beat up a small child. Oh. He paused. I don't know how to compliment you for this without it sounding terrible, but you did a great job at beating up the small child. She snorted despite herself. You should see me fight nuns. He glanced over at the house. What do you think? Should we tell the parents that we found their kid first, or have a go at the demon before we do? Try to get it out first, she said immediately. Trust me when I say that talking to those people is a whole lot worse than wrestling a demon. There's a story there, I take it. There is, but I can tell you about it later at the split log after I've got a few dozen drinks in me. What's the plan? Michael knelt down beside the boy. Benjamin strained his neck to snap his teeth towards him. He stood back up and ran a hand through his hair. We're going to have to force it out, he said, clearly thinking things through as he spoke. He could feel the salt on the skin, and it didn't like that feeling, but it wasn't enough to make it come out. If it doesn't want to come out, Maggie said, we'll have to go in after it. He nodded. Right. The easiest way to get the salt into him is to mix it with water and make him drink it. Depending on how much we need to use, that could get really dangerous. Not just to the demon, but to Benjamin himself. Yeah, I know. When we get the demon out, we'll need to make sure that he drinks as much fresh water as possible. We'll need to flush out his kidneys. Maggie returned to her car and retrieved 3 bottles of water from the rear seat. She always kept water on hand in case she got thirsty while on duty or, as was sometimes the case, needed to wash out a wound. It had never occurred to her that she might need it for something quite like this. Up until this string of disappearances, her time as sheriff had been quiet, maybe even a bit boring. She had liked it that way. She had heard a lot of stories about the odd happenings in Lamplight Woods over the years. Even her own father claimed to have seen something that looked a lot like Bigfoot while he was out hunting. She had never experienced anything herself, though, and she had chalked up all the stories to superstitions and wild imaginations. Mayor Dilfer had brought her into her office on the first day on the job and told her about the town's history and strange events, saying that it was something that she needed to know to perform her duties, but she still hadn't been a believer. Benjamin was still struggling against his bindings when she returned to the backyard. It was hard to be a non-believer now. No matter how much she wanted to convince herself that what she had seen wasn't real, that wasn't possible anymore. Michael took one of the water bottles from her, opened it, and poured out half of its contents onto the ground. He scooped handfuls of salt into the bottle, pausing to shake it as needed. The solution was no longer recognizable as water when he was finished. He handed her the bottle. I'm going to force him to open his mouth, he told her. When he does, pour this in. She hesitated. Okay, I really don't like this. He didn't meet her eyes. Yeah, I know the feeling. There's a demon in there, but it's still a kid. Yeah, let's get this over with. Chapter 21. With a lot of help from Maggie, Michael managed to get the boy up into a sitting position. Benjamin thrashed around the entire time, making something that should have been easy extremely difficult instead. He hoped that the extension cord would hold long enough for them to do what they needed to. Ready? He asked. No, Maggie admitted matter-of-factly. Let's do it anyway. Michael grabbed the boy's face under the chin with one hand and pinched his nose closed with the other. Benjamin seemed to comprehend what was happening and clamped his mouth shut. Come on, Michael muttered as he struggled to keep his grip. I saw you breathing. I know you still need air. The muscles in Benjamin's neck began to strain and bulge. That's it. You may be a demon, but the body you're in is still human. You get all the good and bad that comes with that. The boy's mouth finally opened as he gasped for air. Maggie forced the bottle into the opening and tilted it so that the salt water started pouring in. Benjamin violently whipped his head back and forth, but Michael managed to hold on as she kept pouring. With inhuman strength, Benjamin ripped apart the cord tying his hands together. He knocked away the bottle before they could react and struck Michael hard in the chest. He was spun around and barely managed to get his hands down before his face hit the ground. He turned back towards the boy just in time to see the child begin to retch. Benjamin's entire body tensed, and his mouth opened wide as he vomited. Salt water mixed with a thick black substance splattered onto the ground and dirt. His eyes grew so wide that they looked to be on the verge of popping out of his skull. With one final heave, he ejected a small solid object from inside of him. The object was roughly the size and shape of a golf ball. As Michael watched, it unrolled itself and slowly moved around on the ground. It had dozens of small legs like a centipede, as well as a dark carapace that was reminiscent of an insect's. The head was rounded and, to his horror, almost had a human face. Michael grabbed the second bag of salt and tore it open. Deciding that there was no point in being subtle about it, he dumped the entirety of the contents over the creature. It let out a pathetic cry as the crystals covered its body. After a few seconds, there was silence. Is it over? Maggie asked as she sat up in the grass, having been thrown to one side when Benjamin broke free. I don't know, Michael answered. I think so. I'm going to need something more concrete than that. He nodded and used the empty bag to brush away some of the salt pile. The disgusting creature had shriveled up and broken into pieces. Being careful not to touch the remains themselves, he used a twig to scoop both the dead demon and the majority of the salt into the bag. He rolled it closed and stood up. It's over, he confirmed. Benjamin was stirring. Maggie placed her hand on her gun, but didn't draw it from its holster. The boy rolled over and sat up as he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Thirsty, he said, sounding like he was in a daze. Maggie quickly opened another bottle of water and handed it to him. He took it without a word and drank the entire bottle, barely pausing to breathe in between gulps. She offered him the last bottle when he had finished, and he gratefully accepted it before drinking it just as quickly as he had the first. We're going to need to question him, Michael pointed out. I know, Maggie said, keeping her voice light and pleasant for the boy's sake. He's been through a lot, though. It's going to have to wait. Come on, Benjamin, let's get you back to your parents. He watched as she carefully led the child around the side of the house. The adrenaline was draining away, and he felt like he had just run a marathon. With his limbs acting like they were made of lead, he walked around the seal and used his foot to kick dirt back into the grooves that he had carved. It was best not to leave something for the homeowners to ask questions about. He glanced back at Benjamin's bedroom window. More questions than they likely already had, anyway. He finished what he was doing and looked down at the rolled-up bag of salt. The other missing children still needed to be found, but at least he knew what they were looking for now. He would have to search the records back at Forgotten Tales to see if either his father or grandfather had known of a way to track demons. He started walking back towards the car. Benjamin had been possessed for a few hours at most. The other kids had been gone for weeks, even months. There was no telling what kind of shape they were in, assuming that there was anything left of them at all. He rubbed his shoulder. There was also no way to know just how strong the demons inside of them had grown since the initial possession. He had no desire to face them until he had more information and a better way to defend himself than a couple bags of salt. He opened the car's trunk and put the bag inside. He managed to wedge it into a corner so that it wouldn't come open while he was driving. He wasn't exactly sure what he was going to do with the remains, but he was certain that it was better for him to take them than to leave them in the yard. "You are not going to believe this," Maggie said as he came out of the house. "You know all that stuff in the kid's bedroom? The blood, the growths, all of that?" "What's wrong?" he asked quickly. "No, that's just it. Nothing's wrong. It's gone. No more blood, no more body tissue. It's all disappeared like it was never there in the first place." He relaxed and leaned up against the side of the car. It must have been connected to the demon itself. It can't be a coincidence that it vanished when the thing died. "Yeah." She walked over to him and leaned next to him. "You know, I can't wait for dinner tonight." "What? Why is that?" "Every night, Jenny and I sit down to dinner and have a nice long talk while we eat. It's a little routine that we have. I'll ask her how her day went, and then she'll ask me how my day went." He tilted his head slightly. "I'm not sure that I see where you're going with this." She smiled crookedly. "I killed a demon today. There's no way that she did something more interesting than that. It's an automatic win." They looked at each other and laughed. Just as they were about to stop, they exchanged another glance, and it started back up again. Soon they were both crying from how hard they were laughing. "Holy crap," Maggie exclaimed as they finally got themselves under control. "I needed that." "Same," Michael agreed, wiping his eyes. "I can't tell if I want to go home and sleep or just pass out right here." "You should go home. I think you've hit the ground here enough for one night." He grinned. "You make a good point." Chapter 22. The first hint of daylight was beginning to appear on the horizon when Sarah heard her father return. She had been so involved with her search of her grandfather's room that she hadn't heard him leave, but she had found the note he had left waiting for her when she had gone downstairs. She listened as his footsteps came up the stairs before pausing just outside of her bedroom door. The door began to open, and she quickly laid down and closed her eyes. Seemingly satisfied that she was still where he had left her, her father shut the door and went back downstairs. She opened her eyes and sat back up, her hand fishing the flashlight out from under her pillow. She pushed her comforter down to reveal the small leather book she had found during her search. The cover was soft, and was held shut by a thin strip of leather that was tied in a knot. She undid the knot and opened it. It was a journal. She had never seen its handwriting to know for certain, but based on the dates inside, she was confident that it had been written by her grandfather. It was difficult to read the rough scribbles that constituted his handwriting. As she grew used to it, however, she was completely fascinated by what she was reading. She had gotten about halfway through it before her father had come back home, and she had no intention of going back to sleep until she had finished it. A lot of it didn't make sense. There were terms that she wasn't familiar with, and there was more than one section that appeared to have been written while her grandfather was drunk out of his mind. Much of it simply wasn't legible. Other parts were out-of-context notes or crude drawings. From what she could comprehend, however, it seemed as if he had been desperately searching for something. There was one phrase that kept coming up. Her grandfather had written the words, "flesh to form," throughout the journal. Sometimes the phrase was used as part of a sentence, but in other places it was randomly written in page margins or other odd positions. It was used so often that it seemed like an obsession. She was certain the words tied in with whatever he was looking for, but she had no idea how. The writing stopped about 2/3 of the way through the journal. She flipped the remaining pages, but they were all blank. She turned back to the final entry. It was 2 sentences long. "I have him. I will make things right." She read back through the pages leading up to it, but it didn't look like they had any references to what her grandfather had meant. Who did he have? What did he have to make right? She closed the journal and used the leather strip to tie it shut. She didn't know why, but it felt like it was important for her to find out what her grandfather had been up to. Her father had said that he felt responsible for the man's funeral even though they weren't close. She wondered if it was a similar sense of responsibility that she was feeling. The best place to start was with whatever flesh to form was. If she could figure out its meaning, it might explain the rest of the journal's entries. The trick was working out just how to do that. She unplugged her phone from the charger and searched for the term on the web browser. A large number of hits came back, but judging by the very adult and very naked content suggested this wasn't going to work. She put the phone back down on the nightstand and slipped the journal under her mattress. Turning off the flashlight, she laid back down and went to sleep. It was nearly 10 when she woke up later that morning. Mira was awake, but still lounging at the end of the bed, its belly turned up towards the ceiling as it enjoyed the sunlight coming through the window. She smiled and lightly scratched its fur for a few minutes before getting out of bed. Mira gave her a look that made it clear that it wasn't happy she had stopped scratching, but it dutifully followed her out of the bedroom anyway. She found her father still asleep on the couch when she went to check on him. Being careful not to wake him, she went into the kitchen to get a bowl of cereal and returned to her room with it. Mira regarded her curiously as she ate. According to her father, the animal didn't actually eat, instead drawing what it needed from the planet's electrical field. At first she had thought he had been joking, but he had assured her that he was being serious. Mira didn't seem to understand why other beings had to eat either, as it always gave her a puzzled look whenever she put food in her mouth. She finished her breakfast and took a quick shower. After dressing, she grabbed her backpack and put her grandfather's journal inside. She didn't like hiding things from her father, but until she was able to figure out what the book's purpose was, there wasn't much point in getting in trouble for snooping around in the bedroom. Once she had worked things through, she would hand it over and come clean. She had seen a sign for the local historical society when they had first come into Lamplight Woods and driven through town. It was a long shot, but she might be able to find some answers there. She wasn't sure how she would be able to ask the questions that she needed answered without coming off as completely insane, but she would just have to cross that bridge when she came to it. Her father was awake when she went back downstairs. He was groggy and barely aware of his surroundings, but he was still technically awake. He looked at her curiously as he wiped the sleep from his eyes. "Where are you off to?" he asked with a yawn. "I'm just going into town," Sarah answered, trying to sound as casual as possible. "What for?" "I'm going a bit stir-crazy. I figured that I'd take a look around, maybe check out the library." He smiled slightly. "If the library is anything like it was when we used to live here, it's basically 3 rows of books. Half of those are old copies of Reader's Digest." "Maybe it's changed since then, now the town is growing and there's more money. It's worth a look. See you later, Dad." "Wait." Her father was looking at her with a thoughtful expression on his face. She was sure that he had noticed her eagerness to leave and figured out that she was up to something. There might have been some sound she had made or some look that she had given that tipped him off. He was a trained criminal investigator. There were countless things that he might have noticed that. "There's a bike in the garage," he said. "They'll have to put some air in the tires, but the tires themselves look good. There's a pump in there as well. It's better than walking in this heat." "Oh," she replied, hoping that her surprise and relief didn't show. "Thanks." "No problem. The key to the garage is on the hook next to the back door." She retrieved the key and went outside. Mira followed her across the grass and gravel before sitting down and watching expectantly while she fumbled with the garage door lock. The key eventually turned as the lock released, and she raised the door. There wasn't much inside. Besides the bike and tire pump, there was an old lawnmower that was more rust than metal, various landscaping tools, and, strangely, an ancient garden gnome. She was happy to see that the bike was still in good condition. She put air into the tires and walked it outside. Mira was looking up at her with its head tilted to one side. "I won't be gone long," Sarah told it. "I just need to check on something. Wait here, okay?" The animal disappeared and reappeared in the kitchen window. She waved goodbye to it and started towards town. Chapter 23. Michael watched Sarah through the front window until she had gone out of sight. He let the curtain fall back with a sigh. He hadn't believed her when she had said that she was just going into town to relieve boredom. She was a terrible liar, which, given her level of intelligence, was a very good thing for him as a parent. While he didn't believe her, he still trusted her. She was a good kid, and outside of a few minor things here and there, she had never given him any reason to doubt her. Even if she didn't want to tell him the real reason she was going out, he knew her well enough to know that she wouldn't do anything stupid. He glanced back at the window. On the other hand, she was still a teenager. Teenagers specialized in doing stupid things. He had partaken in more than his fair share of stupidity when he had been one. Still, she was smarter than he had been, and he didn't want to smother her. Being a parent sucks, Evie, he said to the empty store. I just want to go on record as saying that I wanted a turtle instead. There was no response, of course. He hadn't expected one. He had been speaking to Evelyn when he was alone ever since her death. Not all the time, just at the times he was missing her the most. He sighed and went into the kitchen to get a glass of orange juice. Most of his body was sore, and his brain felt like it was packed in cotton. There had been a time when he could have easily brushed off an all-night excursion, but those days had long passed. It was just another sign that he was rapidly approaching 40. Remember when we used to go to Ambrose Lake? He asked, taking a sip of his juice. We'd get there right at dusk and just talk until the sun came up. Well, okay, there's a lot of making out involved too. Can't forget the making out. He went downstairs to the combination basement and living room. He sat down on the couch and set his glass on the table. His shoulder was still aching, and he rubbed at it absently. I've never seen anything like that demon last night, Evie, he admitted. Total demonic possession. Grandpa Charles told me that he had seen a few spirit possessions, but this was a whole new level of fucked up. He scratched his chin. I kind of on the edges of something here, and I have to talk it through. I hope I don't bore you. Michael stood back up and started pacing around the room slowly. Demons don't pop up on their own, he began as he started to piece together his thoughts. They have to be brought into our world, either through an invitation or through a summoning. That means that there's someone bringing them here. There's a purpose behind them. He nodded his head as he continued to pace. I think that's what's causing the blood and tissue growth in the bedrooms. It's some kind of womb. The muscle and tissue grow inside the walls to incubate the summoned demon. It's like the child is slowly possessed while the entity grows, and when it fully takes over, it violently tears itself away from the womb. That's where all the blood comes from. He stopped moving. Wait, that explains why no one saw any of the growth during the early stages. It was connected to the demon. We could only see the demon that possessed Benjamin Harrison under ultraviolet light. It and everything connected to it must be invisible to the naked eye until it starts to physically manifest after the possession takes hold. When the demon disconnects itself from the womb, it's no longer part of it, and it becomes visible. Like pulling a tablecloth off to reveal the table underneath. Shaking his head, he went back over to the couch and sat down. He rubbed at his temples as he felt the beginnings of a headache. He didn't get them often, but when he did, they tended to be harsh. That's all speculation, he said. I've got no proof, but that's where my mind is at right now. I could very much be wrong. Let's just follow the trail for now and see where it leads. So the demon starts out as a sort of a spirit, a new being in our world rather than the fully realized being it is in its own world. That spirit is connected to this womb that not only quite literally births it into our plane of existence, but also helps to grow and mature it. Once it's strong enough, the demonic spirit possesses the child and starts growing its physical form while controlling the child's body. All of this without the parent or even the child themselves knowing what is happening. Was that even possible, though? He wasn't sure. It fit with the evidence he had seen so far, but a lot of it was conjecture, and he doubted that he had all the information. There's another big question, Michael noted. If someone is bringing demons into Lamplight Woods, why do it like this? It seems overly complicated. From what I know about demonic summonings, they can be done without the need for a host. Light some candles, draw a few pictures on the ground, and say the magic words. Yeah, that's a gross simplification, but you get what I mean. Why infect these kids? It felt like he was missing key pieces of the puzzle. Until he found those, There was no way of knowing if he was actually onto something, or if all of this was completely incorrect. It doesn't matter if I'm right or wrong, he said slowly. Either way, it doesn't help track down the kids that are still missing. He paused as an unpleasant thought came to mind. That's assuming that they're even still children. There's been a lot more time for the demons to mature in the others than there was for Benjamin Harrison. He closed his eyes. He couldn't afford to think like that. For now, he had to assume that the missing children could still be saved. If they couldn't, well, he would just have to deal with that if and when it came up. What he needed was some way to find them. He didn't know of a way to do that, but maybe one of his predecessors had. He went back upstairs and into the hidden study behind the bookcase. The study was home to many relics and dangerous objects. It was also where the Dyers had kept a collection of books, notes, and other documents from around the world that provided information about the supernatural. Somewhere in those records might be the key to locating a demon. The collection was separated alphabetically by topic. It only took him a few minutes to locate the shelf dedicated to demons. He was disappointed to find there wasn't much there, just a few books and files. It made sense, though. The Dyers hadn't been interested in every single text that had ever been written about every single subject. They'd only been interested in true accounts and practical knowledge, with a focus on things actually happening in Lamplight Woods. The family business was a small operation, after all, and there were only so many hours in the day. With so much fiction and unsubstantiated lore around demons, it was no wonder there wasn't much factual information. Michael gathered the documents up and took them over to the desk. He worked slowly and methodically, making sure that he went over each item carefully before setting it off to the side and moving on to the next. When he had finished, he repeated the process to make sure that he didn't miss anything. He thought about going through the documents a third time, but he knew that the result would be the same. There wasn't anything in them about tracking a demon. Well, Evie, if I ever wanted to summon a demon, I'd be all set, Michael said, sitting down in the chair. Trying to find one, not so much. He gathered the documents back up and returned them to where he had gotten them from. There either wasn't a way to track a demon's whereabouts, or, more likely, the method hadn't been discovered by his father or grandfather. He was at a dead end. His eyes wandered over to the glass jar sitting on one of the tables. He had transferred the remains of the dead demon from the salt bag into the jar before he had gone to sleep. What he needed was the paranormal equivalent of a bloodhound that could get the scent from it. He felt a shiver run down his spine. There was one thing that had a chance of working, but there was no way that he'd resort to that. I can't do that, Evie, he said into the silence. I won't do that. Even as the words left his mouth, he knew that they were false. What he really couldn't do was fail to explore every possibility to bring the missing kids back safely. Every fiber of his being screamed at him that he was making a mistake, but he didn't have a choice. Fuck, he swore with a violent shake of his head, standing up and retrieving the jar from the table. Chapter 24. There was a nice breeze as Sarah guided the bike into downtown Lamplight Woods. A storm was brewing off in the distance, and it had brought cooler air with it. It was still very warm, and she missed the smell of the wind coming off of the ocean back home, but at least she wasn't sweating out of every pore in her body. It was, however, warm enough for her to be extremely thirsty, even though it was just over a mile from Forgotten Tales to town. She rode up to a convenience store and leaned the bike up against the brick wall next to another one. As far as she could tell, there weren't any bike racks in Lamplight Woods, and even if there had been, it wasn't like she had brought a chain and lock. She went into the store and looked around. She had never seen a place quite like it. There were the usual aisles and coolers that she expected to find at a grocery store, but there were also items like clothing, books, tools, and even car parts. I like to think of it as someone having stuck a Walmart in a dryer, a voice said from nearby. She turned towards the speaker and found a boy her own age looking back at her. He was tall, a full head taller than she was, and his body was thin. He was wearing a plain red shirt and a pair of khaki shorts. A thin pair of glasses adorned his face. "Pardon?" she asked. You know, like it's a shrunk down megastore, he elaborated. A wide variety of items shoved into an itty bitty space. Oh, yeah, I get what you're saying. He smiled. Don't mind me. I'm told that I'm very unfunny for someone that tries so hard to be. My name is Josh Taylor. She smiled back at him, not sure what to make of him. Sarah Dyer. He raised his eyebrows. A Dyer, are you? I shouldn't be talking with you then. She narrowed her eyes. And why is that? Because you'll turn me into a toad or make my hair fall out with a magic spell, of course. Josh's smile widened, and Sarah couldn't help but laugh. Is that really what people around here think of my family? She asked. Some people, yeah, Josh answered with a shrug. Other people think that everyone in your family is completely crazy. Oh, and there are the folks that think you're just a bunch of frauds. And what is it that you think about the Dyer clan? She was expecting a joke, but he surprised her by actually considering the question for a moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was still kind even though the humor was gone. I think, he said, that anyone that makes broad judgments about an entire family tends to have a pretty useless opinion. My dad used to take me into Forgotten Tales sometimes when I was little, and Mr. Dyer was always nice to me. You knew my grandfather? Sarah asked, a bit more forcefully than she intended. Not well, but I met him a few times. He and my dad used to fish together a few times a year. Josh's expression changed as something occurred to him. Oh, I'm sorry. You came in here for a reason, and here I am pestering you. You're not pestering me, she assured him. Actually, it's kind of nice to talk to someone my own age and not related to me for a change. My dad is great, but I've been around him constantly for the past week. I definitely get where you're coming from. Hey, if you're really looking for a change of pace, I'm going to grab some food and head down to the lake for a while. I don't suppose that you'd want to come? She hesitated. She had planned to do research at the Historical Society. On the other hand, she wasn't really sure what she was looking for, so the chances of her finding anything there were slim to none. Yeah, sure, that sounds like fun, she told him. It looks like there's a storm coming in, though. There's plenty of cover if it does, Josh assured her. Besides, a little rain never hurt anyone. Well, you know how us witches are. We melt if we come into contact with water. He grinned. That's true. I guess it all comes down to if you're willing to take a chance then. She arched an eyebrow. You know what? I think I just might be willing to. A few minutes later, Sarah was following Josh as he led her back out of town and down a trail leading into the woods. The storm had drawn closer, but there was still plenty of time before it reached Lamplight Woods. She idly wondered if the dirt trail would be a mudslide when they eventually headed back. She looked at the back of her companion and his bike as she followed. It was very strange. Although she hadn't known him very long, he seemed like the kind of person that would tell you exactly what was on his mind, whether you wanted to hear it or not. At the same time, he came across as both funny and intelligent. She wondered how often that combination got him into trouble. About a mile down the trail, they came to two metal poles, one on each side of the path. There was a chain attached to the one side, and lying on the ground attached to that chain was a metal sign. Josh stopped and moved it out of the way so that they wouldn't have to ride over it. This land is technically owned by the Ambrose Logging Company, he explained, seeing the questioning look on her face. He held up the sign so that she could see it. It was adorned with the name of the company, as well as the logo of a pine tree inside of a green circle. The sign stated that this was private property. It doesn't sound like we should be here, Sarah said nervously. Oh, don't worry, they left Lamplight Woods way before I was born. They still own the land, but no one has used it in decades. Come on, we're almost there. They continued on. Sarah looked down at the sign as she passed it. She was suddenly feeling uneasy. Maybe this hadn't been such a good idea. They came out of the other side of the trees and arrived at a huge clearing with a lake. The water was clean and clear, and its surface reflected the morning sky. They set their bikes on the ground and walked down to the edge. Not bad, right? Josh asked as he waved an arm towards the lake dramatically. Not bad at all, Sarah agreed. What are those? She indicated a pair of dark shapes on the far side of the lake. Those were left behind when the company pulled out. The one on the left is a trailer, and the one on the right is a crane. Some of the local kids hooked up a tire swing to it a while back so they could use it to throw themselves into the water. Oh, so other people come here too? Not just you? He gave her a half smile. Well, yeah. You didn't think I was leading you somewhere to give you the Friday the 13th treatment, did you? She snorted. You can never tell these days. I'm sure Jason Voorhees looked normal at some point. You know, before the whole drowning thing. We are absolutely watching bad horror movies together sometime. He pointed off to their left, where a man and a woman in their 20s were walking around the lake. You don't have to worry about any hockey masks or Kevin Bacon getting stabbed with an arrow. This lake is Lamplight Woods' worst kept secret. Chapter 25. There were a wide range of thoughts and emotions running through Michael as he stood in front of the shed. He let them wash over him for a few moments before mentally shoving them away. It took him less than a minute to locate the hatch. When he did, he opened it and descended down the stairs into the first chamber. Michael recognized the design and layout. The room had been built like a slaughterhouse. The hooks were the same kind used for hanging heavy slabs of meat, and the entire floor was gently sloped towards a drain so that the dripping fluids would run into it. He looked at the sinks thoughtfully. Why would his father have needed to install 4 of them instead of just 1? The only reason he could think of was that it hadn't just been one person using the room. That brought up a whole mountain of questions that he didn't have time to work through. He started to move on when he noticed a metal box just to the left of the sinks. It was dark gray and mounted on the wall, and it had blended into the shadows so well that he wouldn't have seen it if he hadn't been looking directly at it. He went over to it and opened it. It was a breaker box. He flipped up all the switches to the right, and bright fluorescent lights came on overhead with a dull hum. There were 2 small red buttons just to the right of the panel, but he decided against pressing them. He passed through the heavy metal doors and into the room with the cages. With the lights on, he was able to see more details than Sarah had, including a series of wires that ran down the wall and into the cages. He could hear the sound of running electricity even though he wasn't standing near them. The cage bars were electrified. He went through the next door and arrived in the prison-like hallway. There were less lights here, just 1 small light per door. He was tempted to look into each room through the door's sliding panels so that he could view the occupants, but he resisted the urge. He was only here for 1 resident. He reached the final door and stopped. He was feeling much less sure of himself than he had been even 2 minutes prior. Knowing intellectually that he needed to do this was one thing. It was quite another to actually convince himself to do it. Michael felt something tugging at the hem of his shorts. He looked down to find Mira standing next to him, its teeth biting into the fabric as it pulled. The creature's eyes made it clear that it wanted them both to leave. I know, Mira, he said. Leave me. I know. I have to, though. Meet me back at the house, okay? Mira released its grip on the shorts and took a step back. It regarded him intently for a long moment before vanishing. He smiled slightly. It had always been protective of him. The smile faded as he turned back towards the door. There was no point in delaying any further. He reached out and put his hand on the panel to slide it open. Before he could do so, he felt a soft thump against the door from the other side. He instinctively pulled his hand back. He listened as hard as he could, but the only thing that he could hear was the hum from the light above him. Hello, Mikey, an all too familiar male voice said from the other side of the door. It's nice to see you again. There had been a time that voice would have terrified him. Now, though, he found that it instead filled him with anger. His hand clenched tighter against the glass jar he was carrying. He forced himself to calm down. Bingo? Michael replied, hearing the strain in his own voice as he spat out the name. To what do I owe the pleasure? Bingo asked, somehow managing to make the question sound like a threat. Here to reminisce about old times? Those times are long gone. Maybe. There was a short laugh. It doesn't seem like all that long to me. In fact, I can still remember it like it was yesterday. Evie on the ground struggling, me standing over her, you just a little too late to save her. Michael closed his eyes as the rage began to boil over. He wanted nothing more than to throw the door open and attempt to tear the hand puppet to shreds. It was only with every bit of effort that he could muster that he managed to remain in control of himself. If you're not here to talk about the good old days, why are you here? Bingo asked. I need you to do something for me, Michael forced himself to say. Oh, a favor. Why didn't you say so, Mikey? What do you need? I need to know if you can locate demons. How fun. A game of hide and seek without the hiding part. But Mikey, what makes you think that little old me could find big nasty demons? I've been locked up in this metal room for oh so long. Cut the crap, Michael snapped. You and I both know that you have your ways, and being confined like this is just an inconvenience for you. Hey now, that's supposed to be a secret. Bingo laughed again. If I could help you, I would. I wouldn't even charge a fee. I'd be happy to do this teensy-weensy little favor free of charge. There's always a price with you. True, true. In this case, though, I'd say that Evie would have been payment enough. There was a pause. Here's the thing, Mikey. I'm afraid that I can't do what you're asking me to. Michael bristled. Can't or won't? Can't. It was a good thought, especially bringing the dead parasite along with you in case I needed to be your little psychic bloodhound. The problem is that these other beasties that are roaming around out there aren't exactly demons. They walk like ducks, and they talk like ducks, but they ain't ducks. Your deceased friend in the jar didn't have time to work its magic like the others have. What does that mean? Give it a minute and I'm sure it will come to you. You've always been so clever. Fuck you. He thought things through for a moment before coming to a realization. It's the kids, isn't it? That's why the demons were brought into the world the way they were. It's creating a sort of human-demon hybrid. There you go, the puppet congratulated him. I knew you could get there on your own. A new kind of being, one that can be shaped and molded however the one calling the shots sees fit. Like clay to a sculptor, or fire to a pyromaniac. So sorry, kiddo. You're on your own finding them. Michael backed away from the iron door. He had his answer, and there was no reason to stay any longer. He started back down the hallway towards the exit. What? No thank you? Bingo called from inside his cell. No kiss goodbye? Michael paused with his hand on the round metal door leading into the cage room. He kept his back to the hallway, but he turned his head to make sure that Bingo heard him. Someday, I'm going to figure out a way to kill you, he said firmly. When I do, I will end you. There was one final laugh. You'd better do it fast, Mikey, because there's a clock that's ticking. Chapter 26. Maggie had never really felt comfortable in an office setting. When she was growing up, she had basically been shoved out the door at the beginning of each day and was allowed back inside after it was dark, so she was much more accustomed to being outdoors. In her mind, working in an office was just this side of working in a coffin. She avoided her office as much as possible. There were entire weeks that would go by where she didn't see the inside of it. That was how she liked it, and more than once she had mused to herself that the office probably preferred that arrangement too. She shifted in the small chair she was seated in. Being in someone else's office was even worse. It felt like she had been called in to see the principal. She watched the mayor slowly read through the report that she had turned in. The principal analogy wasn't really that far off. So Benjamin Harris is all right? Dilfer asked without looking up. Yes, ma'am, Maggie replied with a nod. His parents had him checked out this morning, and Doc Brenner said that he's fine. Physically, anyway. I can only imagine the dreams the kid is going to have. Hmm. Dilfer set the report down and finally turned her full attention to the sheriff. What story did you tell the parents? Not the truth, I hope. I haven't really told them anything. I mean, how do you explain to someone that their child was possessed by a demon? Simply put, Sheriff, you don't. Some of the older residents in Lamplight Woods might believe you, but the Hendersons moved in when SMR came to town. They'd think you're completely insane. I'll come up with something and speak to them personally. It helps that the boy doesn't remember anything about the ordeal. What will you say? I said that I will take care of it. It's no longer your concern. What about Mr. Dyer? Maggie blinked. What about him? What are your thoughts on him, Margaret? Maggie bristled slightly at the use of her full name. Nobody called her that, and that was by design. She detested it. I don't know him that well, she replied. Humor me with your first impressions, then, Dilfer said firmly. All right. Maggie crossed her arms over her chest as she considered the question. He seems like a decent enough guy. He wants to help these missing kids. Intelligent. Knows his job and police procedures. I guess I don't know exactly what you're looking for here. There was silence. Maggie shifted in her seat again. It felt strange to be sitting there in a short-sleeved shirt and shorts instead of her uniform. While she was always on call as Lamplight Woods' only law enforcement officer, this was technically her day off, and she had planned on enjoying it. So you feel like you can work effectively with him, Dilfer stated. What, you mean work with him on this case? Maggie asked with a frown. For now, yes. Yeah, sure. No problem there. Good. Thank you for coming in, Margaret. I have a question before I go, Mayor. The mayor raised an eyebrow. Oh? Yeah, you told me that you told him that some of the kids were dead. You knew that wasn't the case, at least not that we could confirm. Why would you tell him that? Dilfer waved a hand. To get him to agree to help, of course. I could tell that he was going to need an additional push in the right direction, so I gave him that push. Maggie narrowed her eyes. That's not exactly taking the moral path. I'm not interested in the path that gets taken, Sheriff. I only care about it leading to where I want it to. If there's nothing else? She was being dismissed. With a nod, she stood up and left the office, making sure to close the door behind her. Her opinion of the mayor had managed to sink even lower than it was before, if that was even possible. She felt like she had wasted an hour. Dilfer could have easily read a report without her being present. It wasn't like she had asked a lot of follow-up questions, and the ones that she had asked could have easily been handled over the phone. Maggie stopped by her office to check the mail. The sheriff's department and the mayor's office occupied the same building, along with a number of other town government offices. She unlocked her door and found a pile of envelopes sitting on the floor where the mail slot had dumped them out. She gathered up the letters and deposited them on her desk. There wasn't much room to maneuver, and she had to turn sideways to make it around to the other side of the desk and into her chair. She had used to joke that her office was nothing more than a repurposed broom closet. She had stopped making that joke when she learned that the original plans for the building had actually listed the space as a maintenance closet. She had never been able to decide if she found that funny or depressing. Most of the letters were either junk mail or notices for things that she was already aware of. During her time as sheriff, she had noticed that the state and federal governments loved to send out both emails as well as physical copies of the same things. She raised an eyebrow at one particular notice stating that she needed to renew a required certification before the end of April. It was now June. Luckily, she had already taken care of it before the certification had expired. At the bottom of the pile was a small folded piece of notebook paper with a handwritten note scrawled inside. She recognized the handwriting as that of the office assistant that all the departments in the building shared. There wasn't enough work to justify an assistant for each office, so all non-emergency calls were routed through the same person. Mrs. Clarendon called and said that she heard weird yelling, the note read. Maggie sighed. That didn't tell her much. Grace Clarendon was constantly calling in to complain about her neighbors, even though none of them lived close to her. It happened so often that it had become something of a running joke. Weird yelling was a new one, though. She squeezed her way out of her office and headed down the hall towards the assistant station. More than a few times she had wondered why the building assistant had gotten a larger office than the majority of the town employees there. While she didn't like to be stuck inside, it might have been more bearable if she at least had a window. She reached the office and went inside. She immediately regretted doing so. The assistant, a blonde woman named Caitlin, was lying on her desk with her blouse unbuttoned. On top of her was a balding man at least 20 years older than she was, his tie hanging loose and his shiny head glistening with sweat. They both turned towards her with surprised looks on their faces. "Whoa!" Maggie exclaimed, quickly turned to face in the opposite direction. "What the fuck?" "Sheriff Grant!" Caitlin practically yelled. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. Get off me, Carl." "Don't say my name," the man hissed at her. "I know it's you, Carl Bowler," Maggie said, continuing to avert her gaze. "Damn it." "Please, Sheriff Grant, please don't tell the mayor about this," Caitlin pleaded. Maggie shook her head in disbelief at the whole situation. "Look, I got your note that Mrs. Clarendon called last night. What did you mean by her hearing weird noises?" "I don't know. There was a loud thump, likely from someone getting off the desk. She said that it was really loud, like someone screaming into a megaphone. That's all that she said. I'm so sorry. We were just—" "Don't finish that sentence," Maggie snapped as she retreated from the office. "Not one more word about this if you want to keep your job." Chapter 27. "I have to tell you, I'm simply amazed right now," Sarah said, splashing her feet in the water as she reclined back on her elbows. "I'm a pretty amazing person," Josh replied as he crossed his arms behind his head on the sand. "What I'm amazed at is that a person can be as wrong about something as you're being right now." "What you call being wrong is what I call being the only sane person in the conversation." "Oh, that's what you call it?" "Yep, that's what I call it." She shook her head and laughed. The disagreement that they were having was so absurd that it was impossible to take it seriously, and yet her competitive streak was urging her on. She turned back to him with a look of challenge. "You really think that Sonic the Hedgehog is a better mascot than Mario?" she asked, not even bothering to hide the disbelief in her voice. "Not only do I think it," Josh answered as he returned the look, "I can prove it." She scoffed. "This I have to hear." "I'm happy to explain. Let's start with Mario." "You mean the world's most famous video game character?" He nodded. "I'm not debating that Mario is famous or influential. He's completely iconic. He moves a lot of sales, too. I don't think it's a stretch to say that he's the first thing that most people think of when you bring up video games." She raised an eyebrow. "I feel like you're making my argument for me." "Here's the problem. He makes no sense. Mario is a short Italian plumber that fights a spike-covered dinosaur that repeatedly kidnaps the same princess over and over. Most of that falls into the fine whatever category. Video games aren't usually known for their realism, especially back when Mario was created. It's the first part that matters to this particular topic, though. He's an Italian plumber. How is that representative in any way of Nintendo, a Japanese game company?" "Pac-Man is a yellow circle that eats dots in a haunted house, and Namco uses him as its mascot," she pointed out. "I don't think that we can be too literal with these things." He nodded again. "Agreed, but a truly great mascot should make your brand's message loud and clear. Enter Sonic the Hedgehog. When Sega decided to really push the Genesis, all of the marketing was focused on attitude. Sega took potshots at the competition, which was mainly Nintendo at that point. Sonic was designed with that attitude in mind. The pictures in the ads and even on the box art for his games showed him with a smug look on his face and a finger in the air like he was wagging it at you. He was the perfect mascot for what Sega was going for." Sarah silently regarded him for a moment before saying, "You are a giant dork. You do realize that, right?" "Well, yes, I don't think that was ever in question. Is that a problem? She smiled. I didn't say that. There was a rumbling sound in the distance as the storm grew closer. The wind had picked up, and the sun was hidden away behind the clouds. It wouldn't be long before it started to rain. She watched as the two other people at the lake headed away from the water and towards the woods. After a few moments, they vanished down a different trail than the one she and Josh had used earlier. Apparently, there were multiple places to access the lake from. Looks like we're the only ones that aren't afraid of a little rain, Josh commented. Yeah, she replied. Something caught her eye. Wait, no. Over there, by the trailer. She thought that she had seen movement from the other side of the lake. She watched for it to happen again, but when nothing did, she began to think that she had imagined it. Just as she was about to look away, she saw it again. It was a small figure moving near the side of the abandoned trailer. That looks a lot like a kid, he said, sitting all the way up. Do little kids come here often? She asked. They do, but always with a parent or older sibling. Almost never on that side of the lake. There's a lot of dangerous debris and junk lying around. Should we do something? His eyes narrowed as he considered it. We probably should. The kid might be lost. It's going to start pouring soon. Come on. They stood up and brushed the sand off of themselves. Sarah put her shoes back on and they started walking around the lake. Every so often she would see another flicker of motion from the figure, but it became more difficult to see as the light dimmed from the clouds gathering overhead. I forgot how long it takes to actually walk around this thing, Josh said as they were roughly halfway at their destination. Usually when I go over to the other side, I come in from one of the closer paths. Maybe you're just out of shape, Sarah joked. So why did they shut down the logging company, anyway? Seems like there's still plenty of trees. He shrugged. I don't think that anyone really knows why, at least not for sure. It happened overnight. One day everything was going along as normal, and the next the place was closed when the workers got there for the morning shift. Lots of rumors about it, obviously. Small towns are really good at coming up with rumors. What kind of rumors? Oh, you know, the usual. The facility closed down because of someone dying. The Ambrose family ran out of money. There was some sort of scandal. That sort of thing. Like I said, no one knows for sure what happened. The owners left everything behind, too, which is weird. She furrowed her brow. That is weird. You'd think that they'd want to sell everything off if they weren't coming back. Exactly. Also, why keep ownership of the land for all these years if you're just going to abandon it? Doesn't make a lot of sense. They finally reached the other side of the lake. Sarah looked up at the old crane as they passed it. The machine was covered in dirt and rust. It obviously hadn't been used in a long time. Its boom was lowered so that it was sticking straight out over the water. Where the hook normally would have been was instead a chain that hung down from the arm and wrapped around a black tire. Her foot caught on the edge of something, and she would have fallen if Josh hadn't reached out at the last second to steady her. She smiled at him in gratitude and looked to see what she had tripped over. There was a large piece of sheet metal just barely sticking out of the sand. There's a lot of this scrap along the beach, he warned. You'll need to keep an eye out for it. Past the crane was a rundown metal trailer. It was long, close to 25 feet in length, and it was rounded on the corners. It was a strange comparison, but it reminded her of a big steel Twinkie. They walked around the trailer, but the small figure that they had seen glimpses of was nowhere to be seen. Sarah knelt down to check under the structure. It had been placed on cinder blocks, leaving a small gap between the trailer and the ground. It was dark underneath, and she had to use the light from her phone to see. There was nothing there. I don't see the kid anymore, Josh said as he looked around. It must have left while we were walking. There were a couple minutes there where the crane was blocking our view. We haven't checked inside the trailer yet, Sarah pointed out. It's been locked ever since I started coming here. There's a big padlock on the door. She picked up a silver object that the light from her phone caught. She stood back up and held it out to him. He took it from her with a confused expression on his face. You mean there was a big padlock on the door, she corrected him as he held up the lock to get a better look at it. Apparently so, he agreed. Sarah, this lock isn't open. It's been broken. They both slowly turned to face the trailer's door. Chapter 28. The wind was blowing hard by the time Maggie reached Grace Clarendon's house. Before she got out of the car, she dug around in the glove compartment for a hair tie. It took a few minutes, but she was eventually able to find one and get her hair put back in a ponytail. Although she usually liked having long hair, it tended to repeatedly smack her in the face when it was windy. She got out of the car and paused. Her gun was back at her house inside of the safe in the master bedroom. During her entire time as sheriff, she had never had to fire it outside of a shooting range, and she didn't like carrying it when she was out of uniform. She felt that it gave the wrong impression to be walking around in civilian clothing with a weapon holster belted around her waist. Now, though, she was technically on the job and didn't have her firearm. She sighed and shut the car door. She was responding to a phone call from an 80-year-old woman that had heard some shouting out back the night before. It wasn't like she needed to be armed to handle something like that. She stuck her wallet in her pocket in such a way as to display her badge and started up the stone walkway to the house. The Clarendon house was one of the largest homes in Lamplight Woods. It was 3 stories tall, with a sharply pitched roof and 2 chimneys. There was open lawn in every direction. The nearest neighbor was over half a mile away. The house had once been the nicest in town. Now, though, the years and lack of maintenance had taken their toll. The painted wood was chipped in many places, and the stone pavers that made up the walkway were broken. A number of shingles were missing from the roof. It was just too much house for one person. Grace Clarendon had once lived there with her husband and 2 sons, but her husband had died from liver cancer a long time ago, and the boys had been killed in a car accident soon after. Because of these tragedies, she now lived in the large house all alone. The floorboards of the porch creaked loudly as Maggie stepped onto them. She winced as one particular plank let out a squeak so high-pitched that it hurt. She knocked on the door and waited. There was no answer. She tried again, crossing her arms and cocking her head. When that led to the same result, she pushed the small white doorbell. She heard it chime through the front of the house, but still no one came to the door. Maggie frowned and went over to the side of the porch. She leaned over the wood railing and looked down the driveway. Grace Clarendon's massive Buick was parked at the end of it. She left the porch and walked around the side of the house. The lawn was freshly cut. The flower beds were starting to become overgrown with weeds and unruly shrubs. She reached the backyard and looked over the short fence. There was no one there. She was starting to leave when she noticed that the screen door was open. Maggie opened the gate and stepped into the backyard, feeling her feet sink a few centimeters in the soft turf. The ground made an unpleasant squishing sound as she walked. She made a mental note to suggest watering less when she found the homeowner. She found that the screen door wasn't just open. It had been torn free of the top hinge and was hanging off to one side. Just beyond it, the back door leading into the house was standing open. From what she could see, there weren't any lights on inside. Yeah, no, she muttered to herself. She left the backyard and went back to her car. Retrieving her keys from her pocket, she unlocked the trunk and opened it. On the right side was a long lockbox that had been drilled into the car itself. She unlocked it and opened the lid. Inside was a 12-gauge shotgun with a brown stock and forend. One of the more distasteful parts of her job as sheriff was occasionally having to put down animals, usually deer that had been struck by vehicles. She carried the shotgun in the car for when that service was needed. She loaded 3 shells into the weapon and put 3 more into her pocket. It was very possible that Grace Clarendon simply hadn't heard her knocking, that the old woman had gone back into the house at some point and forgotten to close the door behind her. Maybe the wind had broken the screen door. If there was something less innocent going on, though, Maggie was going to be ready. The past couple of days had shaken her more than she liked to admit. The disappearances had been bad enough, but having to accept that things like demons were real made her feel no longer in control. A week earlier, she would have gone into the house without a second thought. Now she felt like she needed a lethal weapon to do so. She didn't like the change. Maggie shut the trunk and walked back to the house, the shotgun carefully pointed at the ground in front of her. Even though she was a bit rattled, she was determined to proceed safely and rationally. She wasn't going to let her nerves control her and get someone killed. The weapon would stay down until it was absolutely necessary. She nearly dropped the shotgun in surprise when her phone rang. She stopped moving and took a pair of deep breaths to get herself under control again. Berating herself for being so wound up, she pulled the phone out of her back pocket and answered it. "Yeah, hello," she said, much harsher than she intended. "Well, hello to you too," a familiar voice replied. Maggie sighed. "Oh, Jenny, it's you." "What a warm greeting. Are you okay, babe? You sound strange." "I'm fine," she assured her wife. "I'm just handling something. It's a work thing." "Ah, you do know that you're supposed to be off of work when it's not a work day, right? That's kind of how work schedules, well, work." Maggie smiled slightly. "Yeah, well, the exciting life of a small town sheriff and all that." "Hopefully nothing too exciting," Jenny said with just a hint of worry in her voice. "Don't worry, everything's fine." She glanced up at the house and wished that she was as sure as she was trying to sound. "I do have to go, though." "Yeah, of course. Really quick, why don't you invite that consultant guy that's been helping you over for dinner tonight? I can make my famous baked ham." "Sure, I'll call him when I'm done." "Great. You said that he has a daughter, right? Invite her too." "Okay, I really do have to go now." "Right, right. Love you." "Love you too." Maggie hung up and slipped the phone back into her pocket. Taking a deep breath, she put both hands on the shotgun and started walking towards the backyard. Chapter 29. "I really don't think that we should be going in there," Josh said as he bounced the broken lock in his hand. "I agree," Sarah said as she looked at her phone. "This seems more like a job for Sheriff Grant." "Damn it, I'm not getting any signal. How about you?" He pulled out his phone and checked. No bars. This part of Lamplight Woods is pretty bad for signal even on the best days, and I'm sure the incoming storm isn't helping. "What do you think? Head back and call from town?" Josh opened his mouth to answer, but before any words could come out, his eyes shifted their focus away from her and over her shoulder. He closed his mouth as a confused expression fell over his face. She turned to see what he was looking at. Just on the other side of the crane was a young girl. She was maybe 6 or 7, and she was wearing a dirt-stained nightgown. She was standing completely still with her arms at her sides and her eyes staring directly at them. "Where did she come from?" Josh asked quietly. "I don't know," Sarah said. "Do you know her?" "No. You?" "No." The girl continued to watch them silently. Sarah hesitantly took a few steps forward. No matter how strange the circumstances were, this was still a young child that had clearly gone through something bad. "Hey," she said with what she hoped was a warm smile. "Are you okay, honey? Are your parents around? Do you need help?" The girl didn't respond. "It's going to start raining soon," Josh tried. "Looks like it's going to really come down. Is there somewhere we can take you, or someone in your family that we can tell where you are?" This time the girl stirred. She moved her head slightly and opened her mouth. Sarah had crossed half the distance between them, and she could hear the girl's heavy breathing. Sarah stopped moving. Something about the breathing was wrong. The sound was off, or maybe the cadence wasn't right. Her eyes widened. It wasn't the sound of the breathing. It was the breathing itself. The girl's chest wasn't rising or falling. The girl's mouth opened wider, far wider than it should have been able to. It was like her jaw had become unhinged. Inside of her maw was a deep blackness, an endless void of dark. Fingers began to emerge from that darkness. They were thin, almost skeletal, and so pale that Sarah could see the veins under the tight skin. 6 of them extended outward and bent to grip the sides of the girl's mouth, 3 on each side. Beyond them were 2 round objects that were barely visible against the black hole. They were eyes. "What in the fuck?" Josh said behind her in a voice barely above a whisper. The girl took a step forward. Sarah turned and ran. Josh was staring at the girl in disbelief. She grabbed his hand as she went past him and practically dragged him after her. They'd only gone a few yards when the girl was suddenly standing in front of them. She had launched herself forward with surprising speed. They came to a halt. The eyes watched them from inside the open mouth as the girl's head slowly moved from side to side. She bent forward slightly. There was a noise that Sarah couldn't quite identify. It was wet, like thick liquid sloshing around inside of a container. This time it was Josh that reacted first. He reached down and scooped up a handful of sand, and in the same motion he flung it into the girl's face. She instinctively flinched, and both her eyes and the ones peering out from her mouth closed as the sand struck them. He pulled Sarah back the way they had come as the girl roared in an inhuman cry of frustration. Instead of running past the trailer, however, he led them over to the door and flung it open. They hurried inside and he slammed the door shut behind them, sliding the lock closed. "That lock is shit," Sarah whispered as she caught her breath. "If that thing broke through the padlock outside, it's not going to have any trouble with that." "What is it?" Josh asked, obviously trying to control himself and only partially succeeding. "I don't know. It doesn't matter. Right now all that matters is keeping us in here and it out there. Help me find something to block the door with." The inside of the trailer looked just as rough as the outside. They were standing in the small kitchen area, complete with a 2-burner stove and an old refrigerator that looked like it had been around since the 1960s. To the right was a small doorway separating the kitchen from a sleeping area, and to the left was a table surrounded on 3 sides by a built-in booth. "The refrigerator," Sarah said, quickly moving over to it. It was extremely heavy, and the metal exterior whined and creaked as they struggled to move it over to the door. She gritted her teeth and strained against it. It was a slow process, and they didn't have much time. They finally managed to push the refrigerator up against the door. It wasn't a moment too soon, as just as Sarah was letting go of the metal, something slammed into the outside of the door. The entire trailer shook from the impact. There was a second hit, and then a third. Each time she was sure that the refrigerator was going to topple over and the way into the trailer would be clear, but their makeshift barricade managed to hold. The impact stopped as the odd sound of countless tiny bells became audible. It was such an odd noise that for a moment Sarah was completely baffled by what was happening. Once that moment had passed, she realized that she was hearing raindrops striking the trailer's metal roof. There was an eerie silence that was only broken up by the rain. Sarah strained her ears to listen while Josh moved towards one of the trailer's 2 small windows. She watched as he took a deep breath and moved the ragged polyester curtain out of the way to peer outside. After a few seconds, he waved her over. The window was filthy and difficult to see out of, but as far as she could tell, there was no sign of the little girl. Frowning, she went over to the second window for a different angle, but she still couldn't see where the girl had gone. She closed the curtain. "Do you think that she left?" she asked quietly. "No," Josh said with a shake of his head. "I can see her. Barely." She returned to the window he was at and looked in the direction that he pointed towards. She didn't see anything except for the crane in the lake. "All the way back," he said, "just inside the trees." At the very edge of the tree line, barely covered by the overhanging foliage, was the girl. It was hard to tell from that distance, but it looked like her mouth had closed. She seemed to be just standing still and staring at the trailer. "Why did she stop?" Josh asked. "It has to be the rain, doesn't it?" Sarah replied. "It can't be a coincidence." "So when it stops..." "Yeah." She swallowed hard. "She comes back." Chapter 30. Maggie shivered as the rain began to fall. Ignoring it, she closed the backyard gate behind her and walked over to the broken screen door. She knocked loudly on the doorframe and waited for a response. When she didn't receive one, she pushed the screen out of the way with the barrel of the shotgun and stepped inside the house. She thought about calling out to see if Grace Clarendon answered her, but her gut told her that would be a mistake. If she found the elderly woman alive and well, she would simply apologize for the intrusion. If something had happened to the homeowner, however, she'd be giving up any element of surprise that she still had if she made a lot of noise. She slowly worked her way through the short hallway and into the living room. None of the lights were on, and between the closed blinds in the windows and the heavy cloud cover outside, the house was dark. She stopped after every few steps to listen. All that she heard was the rain against the roof and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Maggie had been inside the house once before. It had been during one of Mrs. Clarendon's many complaints. She'd only seen the first floor on that visit. She seemed to remember that the kitchen had a door leading into the basement. It made sense to start at the bottom and work her way up, so she walked over to it and opened it as quietly as possible. To her surprise, the door swung open without a peep. The outside of the house might have needed work, but the inside was very well maintained. She descended the stone steps. Her finger wasn't on the shotgun's trigger as a precaution, but she gripped the weapon tightly and was ready to use it at a moment's notice. She reached the bottom and pulled on a beaded chain to switch on the light. There was nothing to see. The basement was completely empty. The walls themselves had discoloration about halfway up, and she wondered if the reason nothing was stored there was due to flooding. She turned off the light and waited for a moment while her eyes readjusted to the dimness. She then returned to the kitchen and crossed over to the staircase that led upstairs. The house was still silent, and her footsteps sounded extremely loud as she ascended. The second floor landing was clear. She headed towards the first door on her left, passing by a few paintings as she went. They were all nautical in theme, either depicting boats on water or people dressed in sailor outfits. The door to the first room was open, and with one last look up and down the hallway, she stepped inside. Remembering her training, she checked the corners of the room and behind the door to confirm there wasn't any immediate danger. She was sure that officers in high-crime cities were so used to that sort of thing that they automatically did it, but she had to go through a mental checklist to make sure she was following proper procedure. She was standing in an office. A large polished wooden desk sat in the middle of the room, with a blank blotter adorning its surface. 2 leather chairs were placed in each corner on the left side of the room, with a pair of short bookcases set between them. On the wall behind the desk were 4 thin display cases. The tallest case was in the center, and inside of it was a pristinely pressed navy dress uniform. 2 smaller cases, one positioned on each side of the uniform, showed off an incredible number of medals and ribbons. The final case was the widest of the group, and the other cases were set on top of it. Inside of this one was a sword with a gold handle in a black sheath. Maggie hadn't known that Mr. Clarendon had been in the Navy. Judging by the medals and the commendations that were hung on the wall, he must have served in the Korean War. That explained the paintings in the hallway. She went back out of the room and continued to the next door. This one was closed, and she would have to take one hand off the shotgun to open it. She leaned the side of her head against the door and listened intently. After a few seconds, she gave up. Someone could have been screaming bloody murder in there, and she wouldn't have been able to hear it over the wind howling outside. Backing up a bit, she put her hand on the doorknob and braced herself. She turned the knob and opened the door less than an inch before returning her hand to the shotgun. She used the tip of her foot to open the door all the way. The room beyond was a bathroom, and it was empty. There were 2 more rooms on the second floor. She went to the next door and cautiously opened it. It was a sewing room, complete with a large sewing machine and mannequins for mounting clothing. The windows blinds were open, and the way that the light came through it with the rain pouring down outside made it look like the walls were covered with dark running water. The effect was nauseating. She quickly closed the door. The final room was used for storage. Stacks of neatly labeled boxes lined the walls, and there were 2 large wardrobes on the far side. She opened both of them, but she only found rows of coats that smelled of mothballs. There were no bedrooms. She left the storage room and crossed over to a narrow set of stairs leading up. They had to be up on the 3rd floor. She put a hand on the banister and jumped as a flash of lightning startled her. For a split second, the hallway was bathed in bright light. It faded almost as soon as it appeared, and a moment later it was followed by a rumble of thunder. Maggie took her hand off the banister and leaned up against the wall. She took a few moments to steady her nerves. Her finger had unconsciously gone to the shotgun's trigger. She moved it back below the guard and berated herself for being so jumpy. If she wasn't careful, There was a very real chance that she would end up shooting Mrs. Clarendon by accident. There was another flash of lightning, and this time she took it in stride. She once again had control of herself. She gripped the banister, put her right foot on the first step, and with a nod, she started to climb the stairs. She was almost to the point where the floor of the third floor would have completely blocked her view of the lower one when there was a third lightning strike. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught a glimpse of something that made her stop. She turned her head and slowly looked over the hallway below her. There didn't seem to be anything out of place. She waited for it to be illuminated by another bolt of lightning, but when it came, it didn't reveal anything either. Everything was exactly the way that it had been when she had arrived on the house's second floor. She tried to figure out what it was that she thought she had seen. She wasn't sure, but she thought she had caught a glimpse of a dark shape near one of the doors. From where she was standing, though, she could see that the door was still closed and there was nothing near it. She determined that it must have just been some after image from the bright flashes. She continued up to the third floor. The hallway was wider here, and there were only 3 doors instead of 4. One was to the left of the stairs, one was to the right, and the final one was straight ahead at the end of the hall. She chose the room on the left to check first. It was clearly a bedroom belonging to a young boy. The twin-size bed was pushed up against the large window, its blue comforter neatly draped over it. A baseball glove hung from one of the bedposts. At the end of the bed was a box filled so high with toys that the lid couldn't close. 2 posters were hanging on the wall, both for the old Super Friends show. One showed a smiling cartoon Batman and Robin, and the other displayed an equally cheerful Superman. This must have been the room for Mrs. Clarendon's youngest son. Maggie didn't know much about him, not even his name, but she knew that he had been killed when the car he was riding in had lost control and crashed into a tree decades ago. Mrs. Clarendon had obviously kept his room the way it was for all this time. She went across the hall to the opposite room. This was also a boy's bedroom, but it was for one that was older. Shelves covered with baseball and football trophies adorned the walls, and a small desk with a reading lamp was placed in one of the corners. There were posters in this room as well, but instead of being for children's shows, they were for bands like the Eagles and Led Zeppelin. She smiled slightly. The kid had good taste in music. She felt a pang of sympathy for Mrs. Clarendon. She couldn't imagine the pain of having lost 2 children, especially at the same time and so soon after her partner had passed. Somehow the woman had managed to continue onward. She wasn't sure that she could have done the same thing if she had been in that position. There was only the final room at the far end of the hallway left to check. Maggie started towards it. By process of elimination, it had to be the master bedroom. She would probably find the old woman there, maybe taking a relaxing afternoon nap. She would just check to make sure that everything was fine before slipping back out of the house, hopefully without anyone knowing that she had been there. She adjusted her grip on the shotgun. There was also a chance she was headed towards something much less innocent. She opened the door. The room was, as she had suspected, the master bedroom. The bed was nicely made, its blankets tucked in and throw pillows placed at the head. A dresser with a large mirror on the wall was next to the door. A small, uncomfortable-looking chair was tucked away in the corner, and the open closet contained clothes hanging from the racks. There was no one there. Maggie checked under the bed to be absolutely sure, but Mrs. Clarendon was nowhere to be found. It didn't make any sense. If the elderly woman had left the house, she would have driven her car. Nothing seemed out of place, though, and with the exception of the broken screen door, there hadn't been any signs of something bad having happened. There was another flash of lightning, and this time Maggie definitely saw something at the edge of her vision. She spun around and brought the shotgun up. Once again, she didn't see anything that wasn't exactly where it had been when she had entered the room. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She was sure that she had seen something. She lowered the shotgun. It must have been her own reflection in the mirror over the dresser. She was sure that it hadn't been, but there didn't seem to be any other explanation. The ceiling above her creaked. She looked up and watched as particles of dust floated down from the cracked plaster. That hadn't just been the house settling. Something had moved up above her. She went back out into the hallway with her head tilted upward. In the middle of the hallway ceiling was a short cord with a plastic ring hanging from it. She could just make out the outline of a trap door. It hadn't been obvious from the outside of the house, but it appeared that there was an attic above the third floor. She stood still and listened for what seemed like an eternity. She couldn't hear anything but the storm outside. After more than a minute had passed, she reached up to grab the ring. She was too short to reach it even on her tiptoes. Carefully setting the shotgun down on the carpet, she jumped up and was just barely able to wrap her fingers around the plastic. The trapdoor opened with a groan, and a set of wooden stairs slid out through the gap. Retrieving the shotgun, she took one more quick look around the hallway before climbing up. The stairs were narrow, and she had to proceed slowly to avoid slipping off. She reached the top and raised her head through the opening just enough to see into the attic. It was large, extending across the entirety of the floor below it. The ceiling, or more accurately the bottom of the roof, was only about 4 or 5 feet from the attic floor. It sloped inward as it approached the walls. It was dark here, even darker than it was on the lower floors. There was only a single window that she could see, and almost no light was coming through it. She didn't dare use her cell phone for more light. Between her tenuous grip on the ladder and holding the shotgun, she couldn't risk it. There was a muffled sound to her right, and she turned her head towards it. Something was moving near one of the walls, but it was too dark to determine what it was. Ignoring the voice in her head that screamed at her to get out of the house and run as far away as possible, she pulled herself up all the way into the attic. She had to bend over to avoid hitting her head on the roof as she crept towards the movement. As she drew closer, she found that she was looking at Mrs. Clarendon. The woman was sitting up against the wall with her arms wrapped around her legs. She was rocking back and forth slowly. Her mouth was moving, but no words were coming out. "Mrs. Clarendon?" Maggie whispered as she closed the rest of the distance. "Are you all right?" "Sheriff Grant?" the elderly woman asked quietly. "Is that you?" "Yes, it's me. What's going on? Are you hurt? Why are you up here?" Mrs. Clarendon's face contorted as tears began to fall from her eyes. "Oh, Sheriff Grant, you have to go. He's here. You can't be here. He's here." Maggie set the shotgun down and put her hands on the woman's shoulders. "Hey, calm down. Everything's okay. I just went through the entire house. No one's here but you and me." "No, you're wrong. He's here." "Who, Mrs. Clarendon? Who's here?" The woman turned her head slightly and raised her hand, pointing a finger over Maggie's shoulder. "Him. Mr. Skidder."